Morning, Neo-Swedenborgians. Today is October 17th, 2020. It's about 8 o'clock in the morning. So, we're now in chapter 2. And I started this whole thing based on one basic revelation or insight, which is somewhat mundane. It's not really all that huge of an insight. But in the course of chapter 1, I came upon a minor miracle, but it's still a miracle. So let me just bring you up to date. The basic insight that initiated Neo-Swedenborgianism was something that came to me while I was at the University of Washington. The University of Washington has a school called the Henry Jackson School of International Studies, and that's where I went to college. And so I was taking two classes concurrently one year. The one class was the anthropology of death with Professor Green, and the other class was a history of Judaism in Europe with Hillel Kival, Professor Kival. And a curious thing happened. So for the anthropology of death, I was reading up on the near-death experience, which this was in the late 90s, so it was kind of a big topic then, but it got bigger later. But at the time, there was a website, near-death.com, which is still up. It's a good website. And so I was reading up on that for a research paper for my anthropology of death class. And there was a link off of near-death.com to Swedenborg's Heaven and Hell. And I first went and looked at the link, and then I went to my local library in Port Townsend, and they had a copy of the book, Heaven and Hell. So I got out the book. And it's fascinating reading. You don't have to believe it, but if you're into fantasy and sci-fi and all kinds of stuff, there's all kinds of stuff in those books. So anyway, I was reading Heaven and Hell, and then in the history of Judaism in Europe class, we're reading about basically ghettos. You know, if you look at the word ghetto, ghettos in Northern Europe is what we're looking at one time. Reading some, this was a lot of that class was using historical documents. So we're reading these things from the 1700s. Moses Mendelssohn, Felix Mendelssohn's father. These people are all documented. Well, so then I had this. So what ended up happening was the basic revelation or the basic insight was that Swedenborg's description of heaven was quite similar to the historical documents I was reading about Northern Europe at the same time. And I'll preface this, I should have said this earlier, but there's this part of Swedenborg which echoes the near-death experience people today, which is he just says it is self-evident. It's so obvious that it's real. He doesn't spend a lot of time proving that it's real because he says it's self-evident. It's obvious. And the near-death experience people talk about a similar thing where they just say it was more real than real, and they can tell it's real, and they can tell that this world that we're in now is less real. And so when I was reading about the conditions in Northern Europe, the conditions for the Jews in Northern Europe, and it rang very similar to these descriptions by Swedenborg, it crossed my mind that this highly convincing experience that Swedenborg was having, you could just say it's all in his head. And later, when you argue atheist kind of near-death experience argument would be, well, it's all in the person's head. Well, so then the basic revelation is this, that started this whole thing, because Swedenborg has in the library at the University of Washington, Swedenborg's writings took about 8 feet on this shelf, you know. So he was a prolific writer, and that's just his writings from his later life, because his writings earlier in his life, before he had these revelations, aren't really available. But his what's called the Arcana, which means the Secrets of Heaven. He has a series of books called the Secrets of Heaven, and he has Heaven and Hell, and he has some other books. And at the university library, it took up about 8 feet. And now, previously or prior to his religious writings, Swedenborg had been a general scientist. He had been a physiologist and an anatomist and a geologist, but he had actually done a lot of work in anatomy and physiology. So the basic original insight was simply that if it's all in your head, if you believe the skeptics and you go with what the skeptics are saying, the skeptic says, well, it's all in your head. Well, you go with that, and with that, this vast body of Swedenborg's writings becomes physiology. It becomes an extension of his physiological studies. So he studied anatomy, he studied physiology, he wrote on these subjects, and he had this religious experience, and he started writing about heaven and hell. Now, fast forward 200 years to me in my class, and I'm reading about, Northern Europe in the 1700s in one class, and in this other class I'm reading heaven and hell, and I realize, wow, they're really quite similar. Therefore, it's all in his head, and therefore, this whole vast 8 feet of writing by Swedenborg is physiology, because it's all in his head, and all these journeys he takes through his art in his own psyche, and they're ultra convincing. They're more convincing than this world we're in now, according to him and according to the other people who have seen this thing. And so, therefore, the skeptic would say, and this is what we're saying, is that this more real experience is a product of your own physiology. Okay, so that's great. And that's what started this whole thing out. And I started in episode 1 reading from J. Hewitt Mackenzie because this whole physiology thing, Swedenborg had an influence on the spiritualist writers of the 1800s. Okay, so if you read Swedenborg and then you read all these spiritualists, you can see there's a real influence. Well, so if he's talking about his own human physiology, all this spiritualist writings from the next 100 years is like a exploration of that physiological space. Okay, and that's really all I was saying at first, and because that's interesting in itself, I think. And so but then during chapter 1, and now here we are in chapter 2, during chapter 1 I started reading in astronomy about the Van Allen belts. And the Van Allen belts are these bands of energy around Earth. You can read up about it. It's science. Well, while reading the Van Allen belt material, it seemed really familiar, and this diagram of the Van Allen belts, and I went and pulled out J. Hewitt Mackenzie, and lo and behold, they look similar. Okay, that's not that big of a deal. But then if you take the magnifying glass out and you look at the exact numbers J. Hewitt Mackenzie posted in this book from 1916, they match the numbers of the Van Allen belts. And the Van Allen belts are also, there's this physical property around Earth, so they get a little bit bigger and then they get a little bit smaller, right? They kind of swell and shrink. Well, his numbers are right there in the numbers that they give. And so I feel like I've discovered this kind of minor miracle. And I can make this claim, which I agree and I understand. It sounds like an absurd, ridiculous claim, and it sounds like a very annoying claim at the same time. And what's mostly annoying about it is this way that religious people grasp onto little pieces of science and call it their own. And this is kind of a perfect example of that really annoying quality, because to say in one sentence, the Van Allen belts are heaven, really encapsulates that annoying quality of religious people to grab onto some little tiny piece of science and think, well, isn't... So anyway, but I just have to roll with it, because I don't think this has ever been explained before. I mean, not explained, but I don't think this has ever been noticed before. Because J. Hewitt Mackenzie was being read in the 1920, and then after Houdini, all those spiritualists weren't really read as much, and the Van Allen belts weren't discovered until the 50s. And so now I feel like I have to stick my neck out, like this giraffe here, and talk about it and explore it. But the good news is, it's a really interesting subject. All right. Welcome out of the blue. What is this? Number 478. Thanks. See ya. Where are you? There you are.